In this lesson, we're going to add some camera effects to make our scene look as if it was shot with a real camera. Okay, so we've finished up adding elements that are going to add depth to our scene and any extra animation. So I'm going to go ahead and pre-compose all of the layers within my scene to create a pre-comp that I can begin adding some compositing details on top of. So I'm going to unlock this bottom layer just so I can add that to my pre-composed layer. Then I'll select that and go up to the top of my layers, hold Shift, and select my top layer just to select all those layers at the same time. Then I'm going to hit Control-Shift-C to bring up my pre-comp dialog box, and we can just call this layers with depth. Okay, and now I have this pre-composed layer. So now I'm in my main area that I'm going to create my composition with at just the end of my scene. So I'm going to go up here to composition settings, and we want to make sure that the size of my composition is what I want my final output to look like. So I'm going to change this to 1280 by 720, and everything else looks right. So then I'm just going to scale this down so that it fits that size a little bit better. And the only reason why I left that big at the beginning was just so that I would get all the detail that I originally had in my PSD file, and just so that those layers would be big enough that if we did a big sweeping motion with our camera, we would have a lot of room to work with, and we wouldn't be scaling up anything too much bigger than the final size that we're going to use for that comp. So that is just kind of why we've done that up until this point. Okay, so now we have our final size for our composition, and I want to add some more details. So one of the first things I'm going to do is to add this lens flare.psd layer to my composition. So let's go ahead and drag that right down there. And this is just a layer that I painted in Photoshop, and I do this in this way just so that the lens flare that I add is really subtle. It's not going to have lots of little pieces to it, and it just kind of animates really slowly over the top of my whole scene, which helps to add to that really ambient, slow, peaceful look that we have in the scene that we've created. So I'm just going to move my current time indicator here to the beginning of my composition, and then move this layer all the way over to kind of animate it from left to right. So let's bring up the position for that lens flare and set our first keyframe right there at the beginning. Then we'll move all the way to the end, and I'm just holding Shift to move that in a perfectly straight line. And we'll just animate it there across the entire composition. Now let's change our blend mode just so that we can still see our scene beneath it. So to change my blend mode, I'm just going to hold Shift and hit the plus key. And that's going to cycle through all the blend modes that I have. Now I want to see which blend mode I'm using, so I'm going to go ahead and bring those up. So I'll just go down here to where parent is in my columns, right click, go to columns, and hit modes. Okay, so now I can see that I've chosen the color burn mode, which I want to keep kind of looking through here for one that's maybe just a little bit better integrated. Add looks pretty interesting. Now right now it's really, really strong, so let's turn that down in its opacity. So I'm going to hit the T key to bring up my opacity and just turn this down to something like 20%. So it's still there, but it's much more subtle now, and we're just getting a little bit of kind of a rainbow looking effect here at the bottom of our scene. Okay, I also want to add a vignette to my scene, which is just something that happens when you're shooting with a real camera, and certain kinds of lenses may have more vignettes than others. It just kind of causes a dark area all the way around the image here. So to do that, I'm going to add a solid. So we'll go up here to Layer, New, Solid. And this forest green color is going to be the color I choose for my vignette. Now, a lot of people use a solid black, and to me, sometimes that just looks a little bit too harsh. So I like to choose a color that's close to a color in my scene, and then make it a really, really dark version of that color. So something right in here that almost looks black, but still has a little bit of color to it. Okay, so I have that right there. Now I'm going to drop this behind my lens flare. And then I'm going to turn the lens flare off for a moment, and then let's add a mask to that vignette. So I'm going to go up here to my rectangle tool, and we'll move down, and right here where that ellipse tool is what we're going to use. We're just going to draw a circle onto our solid. So kind of get this shape here where the ellipse is kind of filling up this area, but we still have some visible area on the edges. And I'm just going to invert that mask so that I can see the inside. Okay, so now let's go into those mask options and maybe turn this feather up a little bit so that we can not have such a harsh edge. Now I don't want to turn up my feather so much that it just kind of looks like a sort of green cast over my whole image. I'm going to turn that back down. I want to make sure that I can still see a pure form of my color in the middle of my scene. And then to change the rest of this area here, I'm going to go into my mask opacity, turn that down, and if I still feel like I have too much of that green area showing, I can turn up the expansion of my mask and just kind of push that off the corners there so that I'm only seeing it in the very corner of my image. Now maybe even turn the opacity down a little bit more. I want it to be very subtle. So now if I toggle the eyeball on and off, you can see the difference is slight, but it does make a difference, makes it feel a little bit more realistic. Okay, so now I have both of these elements kind of interacting with each other to give me more realism in my scene. And one more thing I can do is to add a lens reflection. So to do that, I'm going to use just my scene that we created earlier. So I'm going to have that pre-composed layer, and I'm just going to hide my other two layers for now. And we're going to duplicate this layer. So select your layer, hit Control D. And now we're going to turn this upside down. So this is just something that happens sometimes with certain kinds of cameras where you get a little bit of a reflection on the glass of the lens. So I want to turn the contrast up in this layer so that I really see a lot of my whites. So I'm going to add the brightness and contrast effect to this layer. So we can go over here to Window, pull up Effects and Presets, and just type in Brightness. And then we'll grab our brightness and contrast from our color correction, drop that on there. And now let's just turn both of those up to something that's pretty high, maybe somewhere right around 80 for both of those. So now I'm getting a lot of white in my scene, and that's what I'm going to use to kind of sell that reflection look. Now I'm going to scale this up a little bit as well, because a lot of times it's going to be reflected on a piece of the lens that's closer to where the image is actually being captured than the image that we are seeing on the outside. So we scale that up a little bit, and now we're going to turn the opacity of this layer way down so we barely just see the most contrasty parts in the whites. So hit the T key to bring up that opacity, and we'll turn this down to just a 1% opacity. Now right now it looks like we didn't change anything at all, but if I toggle on and off the eyeball, you really see just a very, very subtle change, mostly up in this area here, that really just helps to, again, sell the realism of that image. So let's watch a RAM preview of what we've created so far, and we want to turn back on the eyeballs of those other two layers. So I'm just going to hit the 0 key on my number pad to watch that through. Okay, so our RAM preview is finished, and now we can really see the final image that we've created. And really at this point, anything you would add would just be fine-tuning. You can go in, maybe turn down the opacity a little bit more of your lens flare if you feel like that's too extreme. If you want your particles maybe to be a little bit smaller, at this point you could do that. The speed of your birds, but for the most part we've really added a lot of depth to a two-dimensional image that really just started out as something that was completely flat before. And the more that you change your camera angle, the more that you're going to be able to feel the depth that you've created. So maybe go in and tweaking some of your orbit camera tool options. All of that is just going to help to sell your depth a little bit more. So in this lesson, we finished out our scene by adding some elements that help sell the scene as the total package with some realistic camera lens effects.